studio. Now in 1972, Elvis pretty much always used the RE15 microphone, except in Madison Square Garden, for some reason, he switched to an SM57 with a windscreen cover on it.
When researchers finally tested the microphone Elvis Presley used in his final years, they expected to find just skin cells and DNA samples. They weren't prepared for what was hiding on its surface. Was Elvis suffering more than anyone ever knew? And did the people around him know the truth? Join us as we reveal what 47 years of silence finally uncovered. The microphone that witnessed everything. For decades, it sat in a sealed container, away from the light, away from the noise, away from the world that once adored the man who held it. Nobody thought of it as evidence. Nobody thought of it as anything more than a collectible, a relic of a golden era, the kind of object that ends up behind glass in a private collection or buried in an estate sale box. It was just a microphone, a tool, a piece of equipment that had done its job and been quietly retired. That assumption, held for nearly half a century, would turn out to be deeply wrong. The microphone in question was almost certainly used by Elvis Presley somewhere between 1974 and 1977, during the final and most turbulent chapter of his performing life. Those years were defined by enormous concert schedules, sold-out arenas, and a public image that remained larger than life, even as the man behind it was quietly unraveling. Elvis performed hundreds of shows during that period, and through nearly all of them, a microphone was pressed close to his lips. Close enough to catch every breath, every bead of sweat, every invisible transfer of whatever was moving through his body at the time. Two models dominated that era of his career. The Electro Voice RE15 was his longtime favorite, a microphone known for its clean response and its ability to handle the full power of his voice without distortion. He trusted it, and in those final years, trust mattered deeply to Elvis. He was a man who had spent decades learning which instruments, which people, and which routines he could rely on. The RE15 was one of them. Later, as his health deteriorated and his performances became more unpredictable, he transitioned to the Electro Voice CS15E, the microphone that would ultimately become his last. Both were held the same way, gripped firmly, brought right up to his mouth, close enough to catch everything. That proximity is what makes the microphone so significant. A guitar stays at a distance. A piano never touches the performer, but a microphone, especially the way Elvis used one, becomes almost an extension of the body. It is held during the highs and the lows, gripped during moments of power and moments of weakness, pressed close during every breath of every song. Whatever was happening inside Elvis Presley during those final performances, whatever his body was carrying, the microphone was right there for all of it, and when scientists finally looked closely enough, they realized it had been collecting far more than sound. But before they could understand what they found, they first had to understand the man those final years were slowly consuming. Elvis's final years, two realities. There were two versions of Elvis Presley in those final years, and most people only ever saw one of them. The version the public saw was still magnetic, still capable of moments that could silence a room and make thousands of people feel something they couldn't name. He walked out onto enormous stages. He took the microphone in his hand and he sang. Sometimes the voice that came out was the voice of a man who had not aged a single day since 1956. Sometimes it silenced even the people who worked with him every night, people who had heard it thousands of times and still were not prepared for what it could do. That version of Elvis was real. Nobody who saw him perform in those years could honestly claim otherwise. But there was another version, one that existed in the hours before the show and the hours after it, in the tour buses and the hotel corridors and the dressing rooms that the public never entered. That version was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. He was isolated in the particular way that extreme fame creates, surrounded constantly by people and yet genuinely alone in almost every meaningful sense. The inner circle around him, the handlers and managers and medical staff and loyal associates who had attached themselves to his world, formed a kind of buffer between Elvis and ordinary life that made real connection almost impossible. He had money, he had adoration, He had every material comfort imaginable, and he was profoundly structurally cut off from anything resembling a normal human existence. The medication use that surrounded Elvis during this period has been documented, debated, and disputed for decades. What is broadly understood is that he was prescribed an extraordinary range of substances by doctors who were either unable or unwilling to push back against his requests, and that the volume and variety of what he was taking had grown far beyond what any healthy regimen would have looked like. Whether that constituted addiction, dependency, negligence, or something more deliberate depends on who is telling the story. What is harder to dispute is the physical toll. His weight fluctuated dramatically, his energy levels were unpredictable. His ability to sustain the demands of a punishing tour schedule was visibly declining, even as his management continued booking shows at a pace that would have challenged a performer half his age in perfect health. Through all of it, the microphone remained the one constant between both worlds. Every night, no matter what had happened in the hours before, Elvis took the stage, and he took the microphone with him. What that microphone absorbed during those performances, it turned out, was a far more complete record of his condition than anyone had ever realized. Why scientists revisited it. For most of its existence after Elvis died, the microphone simply waited. It passed through the hands of collectors, people drawn to the mythology of the man and the era it represented, people who understood its value as an artifact, even if they had no idea of its value as anything else.
Oh, God, no!
It was cataloged, stored carefully, and kept in the kind of controlled conditions that serious collectors apply to serious pieces. It was treated with respect. It was not treated with curiosity. There was no particular reason, for a very long time, to think of it as anything other than what it appeared to be. The shift came gradually, driven not by anything specific to Elvis, but by a broader transformation in what forensic science had become capable of. In the decades since the microphone was last used, the tools available for analyzing physical objects had changed in ways that would have seemed implausible to the scientists of Elvis's era. Techniques developed for criminal investigations, for archaeological study, for medical research, had been refined to a point where trace evidence invisible to any previous method of detection could now be isolated, identified, and understood with remarkable precision. Objects that had once seemed to hold no information beyond their visible surface had become, in the right hands, extraordinarily detailed historical records. A collector who held the microphone in their private archive agreed to allow a team of researchers to conduct a forensic analysis. The stated goal was straightforward, almost modest in its ambition. This was historical curiosity, an opportunity to apply modern methods to a significant cultural artifact and see what, if anything, could be learned about the performer who had used it. The expectation was that the results would be interesting in the way that most such studies are interesting, yielding small details that might add texture to a biography without fundamentally changing anything that was already understood. It was the kind of project that proceeds quietly, without urgency, because nobody involved is expecting a surprise. The team prepared their equipment, established their protocols, and began the process of examining a surface that had not been meaningfully disturbed in nearly half a century. They were methodical. They were careful. They were entirely unprepared for what the analysis would reveal. What started as a routine examination of a preserved piece of music history was about to become something that made the scientists conducting it stop and look at each other across the room. Because the first round of results looked completely normal, and it was only when they looked deeper that everything began to change. First tests. Nothing unusual. The early results came back exactly as expected, and for a brief window of time, everyone involved breathed a little easier. The initial sweep of the microphone's surface returned the kind of data that made complete sense for an object that had spent years pressed against the face of one of the hardest working performers in the history of live music.
Sweat residue, skin cells, microscopic fibers from stage costumes and handling cloths. The biological fingerprint of a man who had poured himself into hundreds of performances, night after night, city after city, arena after arena.
It was the profile of intense physical labor, of a body pushed hard under hot lights in front of enormous crowds, and it matched precisely what the researchers had anticipated finding. The sweat residue alone told a story that was consistent with everything already known about Elvis in his final touring years. His performances were physically demanding in a way that few entertainers of his era could match. He moved constantly, he engaged the audience at full intensity, and he did it while wearing elaborate costumes in venues where the heat generated by lighting rigs and packed crowds created conditions that would have exhausted a far younger and healthier man. The levels of biological material detected on the microphone's surface reflected all of that. They were high, but they were explicable. They pointed toward effort, not toward anything darker. The fiber evidence added further texture to the picture. Different materials, different thread compositions, suggesting the microphone had been handled at various points by different people, roadies, sound technicians, members of Elvis' personal staff, who were responsible for preparing his equipment before each show. This, too, was unremarkable. A stage microphone does not belong exclusively to the performer. It passes through many hands before it reaches the stage, and the physical record of that handling was visible in the analysis exactly as it should have been. The skin cell deposits were perhaps the most personally direct of the early findings, traces of Elvis himself, biological material that had transferred from his hands and his face during use. Material that, in a different kind of investigation, might have carried far more weight. But in the context of these first tests, they were simply confirmation. The microphone had been used heavily and repeatedly by a specific individual, and the surface bore the evidence of that use in a way that was entirely consistent with the historical record. The team documented their findings carefully and moved to the next stage of analysis. There was nothing here to alarm anyone. Nothing that suggested the examination would yield anything beyond what they had already found. Plot twist: the chemical signature. The second phase of testing required more advanced instrumentation, tools capable of detecting not just biological material, but chemical compounds at the molecular level. Residues so small and so deeply embedded in the microphone's surface that no earlier form of analysis would have registered them at all. The researchers ran the scans methodically, working through the protocols they had established, and for the first portion of that process, the results continued to look unremarkable. And then, in the data coming back from the deeper layers of the surface material, something appeared that made the team slow down and look more carefully. Pharmaceutical residues. Not the kind of faint, ambiguous trace that might be explained away by environmental contamination or casual handling. What the scans were detecting were complex chemical signatures, compounds associated with prescription medications, present in concentrations that spoke not of occasional or incidental exposure, but of repeated, sustained, and heavy contact over an extended period of time. The microphone had been held close to Elvis Presley's mouth for hundreds of performances, and whatever his body had been processing during those performances had been transferring invisibly and continuously onto its surface. The concentrations were the detail that shifted the atmosphere in the room. Trace amounts of pharmaceutical compounds on a surface used by a performer would not, in isolation, be especially surprising. Medications pass through the body and leave evidence in sweat, in breath, in the microscopic biological outputs that accumulate on anything held close to the skin over time. The levels detected here were not trace amounts in any ordinary sense. They were significant enough to suggest that the exposure had been frequent, that the substances involved had been present in Elvis' system at high levels, and that this had been a consistent reality across the period when the microphone was in use. What the compounds specifically were, and what their presence at those concentrations implied about Elvis' physical condition during performances, was a question the researchers were not yet in a position to fully answer at that stage. But the direction the findings were pointing was deeply uncomfortable. A man performing in front of tens of thousands of people, holding a microphone to his lips, pouring everything he had into every show, had been carrying something far heavier than the audience ever knew. The image of Elvis on stage, powerful and commanding, began to sit alongside a different image entirely, one of a body quietly broadcasting its own distress into the object it held every night. And when the researchers began mapping those chemical signatures against the known timeline of his equipment use, they found that the microphone itself had been keeping a record of something nobody had ever thought to look for. The microphone timeline hidden clues. To understand what the chemical findings meant, the researchers needed to place the microphone inside a larger story. The story of how Elvis's relationship with his equipment had changed across the full arc of his career. Because it had changed, and the changes, when mapped carefully against everything else known about his life and his health, began to look like something more than simple professional preference. In the 1950s, Elvis and the microphone were still finding each other. The Shure Super 55 became the image most people carry in their minds when they picture him in those early years. A vintage-style ribbon microphone that suited the aesthetic of the era perfectly, and became so associated with him that it remains iconic decades later. In the recording studios of that period, he worked with the RCA 44A and the 77DX, microphones chosen for their warmth and their ability to capture the specific qualities of a voice that sound engineers were still learning to understand. He was young, he was healthy, he was a phenomenon that the music industry was scrambling to contain and capitalize on, and his equipment choices reflected a period of pure, uncomplicated ascent. Through the 1960s, his studio work brought him into contact with the Neumann U47 and M49, microphones of exceptional quality favored by serious recording engineers across that era. His voice during this period was widely regarded as being at or near its peak, a controlled and remarkably versatile instrument that he was learning to use with increasing sophistication. The equipment around him matched that sophistication, chosen by professionals who understood both the technology and the voice they were serving. Then came 1968, and with it, a shift that would define the final chapter of his career. The Electro Voice RE15 entered his life and quickly became his constant companion on stage. He trusted it in a way that spoke to something beyond technical preference. It suited him. It handled his voice cleanly, and in the years of his comeback and his early Las Vegas residency, it was the microphone that witnessed his return to live performance at the height of his powers. Elvis was, by every account, a performer who prized consistency. He liked what he knew, he trusted what had worked before, and he was not a man who changed his equipment without reason. The RE15 served him well for years, and he had no obvious motivation to move away from it, which is precisely what makes the sudden pattern of equipment changes that began around 1974 so difficult to explain away as simple professional preference. Plot twist. Sudden equipment changes. For years, the RE15 had been the answer to every question Elvis had about a stage microphone. It was reliable, it was familiar, and it had been with him through some of the most celebrated performances of his later career. He knew how it felt in his hand, he knew how it responded to his voice, and he had built an entire performance style around the confidence that comes from trusting your equipment completely. In the world of live performance, that kind of consistency is not a small thing. It is the foundation that allows everything else to happen. And then, without any clean or obvious explanation, it began to erode. Around 1974, the equipment records surrounding Elvis start to tell a more complicated story. In Las Vegas, where he had become a permanent and enormously profitable fixture, he was documented using the AKG-D224, a microphone with a different character and a different physical profile from the RE15 he had relied on for years. On the road, during the touring schedule that his management continued to expand despite growing concerns about his condition, the Beyer M160 appeared, and running alongside both of these, increasingly becoming the microphone most closely associated with his final performances, was the Electro Voice CS15E, a model that would ultimately be the last microphone Elvis Presley ever held on a professional stage. 3 different microphones, introduced across a relatively short window of time, after years of near total consistency. The question of why sits at the center of this part of the story, and the answers that have been offered over the decades are not entirely satisfying. Vocal strain is the explanation most often reached for first, and it is not an unreasonable one. A voice used as heavily as Elvis used his, across the kind of touring schedule he was maintaining in those years, will change. It will develop sensitivities and limitations that it did not have at 25 or 35, and a performer attuned to his own instrument will often seek equipment adjustments in response. Different microphones handle the upper and lower registers differently. They respond differently to changes in breath pressure and projection, and a performer whose voice is shifting might reasonably experiment with his options. But vocal strain alone does not fully account for the pattern. The changes were frequent enough and varied enough to suggest something less focused than a simple search for better vocal support. They point instead toward a performer whose relationship with his own physical capabilities was becoming unstable, someone who was no longer entirely sure from one performance to the next what his body was going to give him, and who was adjusting his equipment accordingly, searching for something that could compensate for a decline he could feel but could not publicly admit. The microphone changes were not random. They were responses, adjustments made by a man who knew, even if nobody around him was willing to say it plainly, that something was going wrong. And when the forensic analysis was placed alongside those equipment changes, a pattern emerged that the researchers had not anticipated and could not easily dismiss. Plot twist: the mismatched residues. The pharmaceutical residues detected in the earlier phase of testing had already raised serious questions. But as the analysis continued and the researchers began cross-referencing the chemical signatures with the documented medical history available to them, a new and considerably more disturbing layer of the picture began to take shape. The compounds identified on the microphone's surface did not all match the official record of what Elvis Presley had been prescribed. Some of the residues corresponded to medications that appeared in the known documentation of his medical care during those years, substances that had been prescribed by the physicians in his circle and that had been reported, at least partially, in the accounts that emerged after his death. Those findings, while troubling in their concentrations, were at least explicable within the framework of what was already understood about his health management. They confirmed what many had long suspected about the scale of his pharmaceutical use, but they did not go beyond it. The problem was the residues that fell outside that framework entirely. Certain chemical signatures detected on the microphone's surface did not correspond to any substance recorded in the official prescription documentation that researchers were able to access. They were not ambiguous matches or partial correlations that might be explained by chemical degradation over time. They were distinct compounds, present in detectable quantities, that pointed toward substances which had no obvious place in the official medical record of Elvis Presley's final years. The implications of that gap are uncomfortable to sit with, and they branch in several directions. One possibility is that the documentation itself was incomplete, that prescriptions were written, and medications were dispensed in ways that were not fully captured in any single record, a scenario that would not have been unusual given the number of physicians who were involved in Elvis's care and the chaotic, overlapping nature of his medical arrangements. Another possibility is that substances were reaching him through channels that bypassed the official prescription system entirely, obtained informally, passed along by members of his inner circle, or sourced in ways that would have left no paper trail of any kind. Either possibility points toward the same underlying reality, which is that what was moving through Elvis Presley's body during those final performances was not fully known to anyone outside an extremely small group of people, and may not have been fully known even to him. A man who trusted the people around him to manage his care, who had long since handed over significant control of his own daily functioning to handlers and physicians and associates with their own interests to protect, may not have had a complete picture of what he was being given. The microphone had captured the chemical evidence of all of it, every night in silence, for years, and when the researchers brought together everything the forensic analysis had revealed and held it against the broader story of those final years, the theory that emerged was as sad as it was damning. The dark theory. What was really happening? By the time the full picture of the forensic findings had been assembled, the researchers were no longer dealing with a historical curiosity. They were dealing with something that reframed one of the most debated and painful chapters in the history of popular music, and they were doing it not through speculation or secondhand testimony, but through physical chemical evidence that had been quietly preserved for nearly half a century on the surface of a microphone. The theory that the evidence pointed toward was not a new one in its broad outline. The people closest to Elvis in his final years, the physicians who prescribed without adequate oversight, the managers who booked tours that a healthy man might have struggled to complete, the handlers and associates who formed the wall between Elvis and the rest of the world, had long been subjects of scrutiny and criticism. The suggestion that Elvis was kept performing beyond any reasonable limit, maintained in a functional enough state to walk onto a stage and deliver a show, regardless of the cost to his body or his long-term health, had circulated in biographies and documentaries for decades. What the forensic analysis added to that theory was weight. The pharmaceutical concentrations detected on the microphone were consistent with a body that was being managed chemically in ways designed to sustain output rather than to protect health. The mismatched residues suggested that the management of his condition was broader and less transparent than the official record acknowledged, and the timeline of his equipment changes, read alongside the chemical data, told the story of a performer whose physical reliability was declining in ways that the people around him were responding to practically, adjusting his tools rather than addressing the underlying crisis. There is a particular cruelty in that picture. The audiences who filled those arenas in the mid-1970s came to see a legend, and in many cases, they got one. Elvis could still produce moments of genuine, overwhelming power, the voice breaking through whatever was weighing on him, and delivering something that nobody else on earth could have delivered. But those moments were being extracted from a man who was running out of the capacity to produce them, and the extraction was being managed by people whose primary concern was not his survival. The audio record from those final years carries its own evidence. Vocal inconsistencies appear across recordings from that period, moments where the voice tightens or loses its center, followed by passages of startling brilliance that make the inconsistencies even harder to understand. The microphone was present for all of it, receiving the full physical broadcast of a man in serious decline, and encoding that decline into its surface in ways that nobody thought to examine for nearly 50 years. The last piece of the story, the detail that the microphone ultimately had no way to hide, would bring everything together in a conclusion that was as haunting as anything the researchers had expected to find. The silent witness. The microphone did not lie. That is the detail that stays with you when everything else has been considered, when all the theories and the timelines and the chemical signatures have been laid out and examined. Through every performance, every struggling breath, every moment of brilliance, and every moment of barely contained collapse,
Lord have mercy.
the microphone recorded the truth of what was happening to Elvis Presley in a language that nobody thought to read until it was nearly half a century too late. It was a silent witness to everything the world missed, and it had been waiting patiently for someone to finally listen.